Hello, folks. Ben Phillips here from MSU Extension. Welcome to this webinar, originally hosted on February 18th, 2025. I invited Christie Hoepting from Cornell Extension to talk about onions. I prompted her with a question we get commonly from direct market growers who transplant sweet onions and shoot for colossal sizes for fresh market sale in July and August, and then want to convert some proportion of that production into a fall storage crop. The question is, how can we reduce the occurrence of internal rots that tend to shrink that storage stock? Christie will take us through the factors that influence internal bulb rots and how you can tweak those factors during the field season, during harvest, and in storage. I forgot to push record at the start of the session. So after this, we'll be starting just a few slides in where Christie is explaining about bacterial pathogens and how they are really the root cause of this whole conundrum. And then the whole rest of the webinar goes very smoothly. So enjoy.
And with the Stop the Rot project, my team produced a 4-minute video to help you diagnose bacterial diseases in the field and distinguish them from other lookalikes. The bacteria live in the soil. They infect onion leaves predominantly in the neck region of the plant. Bacteria come in contact with onion leaves via splashing soil, wind blasting, sideways rain, cultivation, anything you can think of that can move the bacteria contaminated soil into the neck region of the onion. Bacteria also may enter through wounds caused by hail injury or during topping at harvest, or anything else that you can think of that can injure an onion plant. Onion plants are most susceptible to bacterial disease between early leaf senescence, which is 5% tops down, to 50% tops down. So that is the time when the neck has reached its full size, but it's starting to soften, so it's less resistant to entry from bacterial diseases. Also, the plants are still quite green at that time. There's a thick canopy, longer periods of leafal wetness, maybe poor aeration in the canopy, conditions that are more suitable for disease development. Free moisture is absolutely critical for infection, spread, and disease development, which is favored by warmer temperatures. We tend to see the worst outbreaks in higher temperature, 80s, 90s. And disease is going to spread down the leaf, through the neck, and into the bulb. It moves in green tissue because it needs that moisture. And another fun fact, onion bulbs have antimicrobial properties. So just because you see symptoms in the leaves doesn't mean that strain of bacteria will be able to survive in the bulb. All right, to illustrate the importance of moisture in the development of bacterial disease, here are some results from the Stop the Rot project from California. This is with sweet onions, where they were comparing overhead irrigation to drip irrigation, which was applied from the 6-leaf stage until the end of the season. And you can see that, and it's the same amount of water that both treatments got, that overhead irrigation resulted in 22% rot, which was significantly reduced to less than 1%. So a 97% reduction in rot just by switching from overhead to drip irrigation, illustrating how important moisture is in driving bacterial diseases. If you are a small-scale sweet onion grower and you have the ability to use drip irrigation instead of overhead irrigation, drip irrigation can go a long way for managing bacterial diseases. Here's a study out of Washington from the Stop the Rot project. They're looking at overhead irrigation cutoff timing. So we're looking at 2 trials, and we're looking at natural infection compared to inoculated on the left and the right there. The second brown bar is their standard at 50% tops down, and then the late at 90% tops down. So basically, every 2 more weeks that you run that overhead irrigation, bacterial bulb rot increases. So this had a lot of value for growers out west to stop their irrigation at 50% and not irrigate after that. Of course, we are at the mercy of Mother Nature if she decides to, what I call a rot rain on us in August. So now moving on to when to harvest onions. You want to harvest onions when the process of bulbing is complete. So you're going to notice that the plants are not putting on new leaves. the neck gets soft, and then they lodge or fall over, and the roots begin to die. During lodging, the nutrients, including those sulfur and sugar compounds, are translocated from the leaves into the bulbs. So dry matter and pungency increase, which is related to increased storability. So if you harvest an onion before it's reached its full maturity, it doesn't have the dry matter. It hasn't reached its full storage potential. Also, the bulbs would continue to put on size up to 25 to 33% during lodging until the roots are loose. So when I'm scouting, I will tug on some plants and see if the roots are holding on or if they're letting go. Okay, time to harvest. You want to pull storage bound onions when they have a maximum of half of the leaves being green. Ideally, we're pulling onions between 50 and 80% lodging. If you pull them at greater than 80% lodging, then the skins can be loose and easily sawn off, and the onions may not look as nice. So if you've got a thin skin variety, you might want to pull that a little earlier. And then also, if we're out in September and it's moist and the onions start re-rooting, well, once they start rooting, then the roots trigger sprouting and you can get more sprouting. These are some photos that I took from a fungicide trial that I did. We are looking at 2 weeks after the last fungicide spray went on at 50% lodging. So at this time, we want to have more than 50% green foliage to reach our maximum yield potential. If it's less than that, we've seen a decrease in yield. So talking about healthy foliage, unfortunately, I have seen thrips, Symphylium leaf blight, downy mildew that get so bad that the foliage is so ravaged that it doesn't have enough weight to lodge properly. This is what we call onions dying standing up. If there's more than 30% leaf dieback at the onset of lodging and you can't control those diseases or the thrips, that crop could go on to die standing up. I've done studies that have shown that when onions die standing up, they have twice as more bacterial rot than their counterparts that lodge normally. So when an onion dies standing up, it's alternating the host in a way to make it more susceptible to bacterial infection because that sensitive neck area is wide open and it's not protected as it is when the onions lodge properly. So I did a study, part of the Stop the Rot project, to see if we could gently roll the onions over. So their necks are soft. They should be lodging. They just don't have enough weight to lodge. And so we're just going to gently roll. We're not causing any injury to the foliage. And I was just using an empty seed pail. My growers are using very lightweight plastic 50-gallon drums. Maybe something like this with one barrel could be used for sweet onions, or maybe you could use even just a simple bucket. In an artificially inoculated trial, I had 14% rot in the onions that were standing up and a significant 57% reduction with the onions that were rolled. So I got it from 14 to 6%. In another study, I had a 30% reduction. So we know that when onions are dying standing up, they are more susceptible to new bacterial infections. We know that when we roll them, we are protecting that neck area from new infection. And the only thing we don't know is if there's going to be, quote unquote, a rot rain that's going to cause splashing soil bacterial pathogens to get into that neck area. So our growers are it's so easy. We're just going to do it. Okay. So now if you've got healthy foliage, but you're starting to see foliar symptoms of bacterial disease, and if you cut open those plants that the rot is not yet in the neck, can we win the quote unquote rot race? And by rot race, the race to get the neck dried down, which will make it impassable before the bacterial disease enters into the bulb. One way that we might be able to do that is by pulling the onions early so that they're drying down. So here are some study results from the Stop the Rot project from Washington. We're looking at 2 different trials. The first set of data is the rot data. The second set is the yield. And in red, we are looking at pulling the onions 14 days early when there was 50% tops down and the foliage was 90 to 100% green compared to their standard pulling time, which is 90 to 100% tops down, and the plants have 0 to 5% green foliage. And so you can see that pulling early significantly reduced rot by 15 to 20%. And in the second trial, they had no difference in bulb rot, but we see a yield reduction with that early pulling. So you can see that There could be a benefit to winning the rot race, reducing the amount of rot that gets into the bulb by pulling early and getting those plants dried down, but it could be at the expense of yield. So it's a trade-off, which is why I really like the idea of rolling, because the roots are still intact and they can still put on size. So this is actually a recommendation from Beth Gugino at Penn State with specifically sweet onions. She's recommending to scout your onions and harvest when 1 to 2 leaves are starting to collapse. So that's the sweet spot. Okay, when we're pulling the onions, we're windrowing them. And for large scale production and mock, we like to see that as a single layer. What we're really trying to avoid is thick piles of onions with lots of leaves. Sometimes there's weeds in here. That's just going to take longer to dry down and cure. Avoid exposing the bulbs to direct sunlight, especially when they're green. That can lead to sun scald. So an alternative is to lay the leaves of other plants over top of the bulbs. This is a plot that I harvested. The conditions that are favorable for sun scald and black mold are if you're harvesting when the temperatures are in the high 80s and 90s, and black mold particularly when the humidity is in the 90s. You can avoid harvesting under those conditions. That may be helpful for avoiding sun scald and black mold. Some growers are actually taking the onions out of the field and letting them dry down inside a hoop house. Furthermore, putting a shade cloth over that. We're trying to keep the temperature below 85 degrees, and you need to ensure that you've got good air movement in this situation. Okay, so now we're moving on to topping the onions. The greener the neck of topping, the greater the risk of bulb rot. Bacteria moves in green tissue. The soil, which is contaminated with bacterial disease, will stick to the green necks. And then you're introducing your pathogen to just basically a tunnel to make its way to the bulb. Here's a study out of Washington where they're looking at topping onions early when they're at 50% tops down, when they're at 90 to 100% tops down, or when the onions have pretty much dried out. And the moisture in the neck is 91% compared to 60 compared to 18. You can see how much rot can happen when you're topping onions when they're very green compared to just waiting till you've got 50% tops down. A 65 to 89% reduction in bulb rot. For your sweet onions, if you can just wait a little bit longer, that potentially could go a long way. And it's not just bacterial pathogens that could come. You can get botrytis neck rot as well. And so here's a visual of how green those necks are. And this is just a visual of rolling your fingers over the neck. And if it slides, it's not ready to top. And if it's sticky and you can't move it, then it's ready to top. Okay, we are recommending leaving a 2 to 3 inch neck length when you're topping onions, especially when there's green leaf tissue. And schematic diagram of 2 trials out of Georgia from the Stop the Rot project. And you can see 18% rot when they left 0 to 1 inch necks was significantly reduced to about 10% when they left a 2 to 3 inch neck. And the same thing in the second trial. 24% rot is reduced to 10%. So by leaving a 2 to 3 inch neck length, you can significantly reduce bacterial bulb rot by 36 to 66%. So very significant, something that's very easy to implement. You want to harvest when weather is dry, not after a rain, not when there's dew on the onions. Once you're introducing moisture to the system, it's just going to take longer for the onions to dry, and it's more favorable for disease. Theoretically could stimulate roots, and roots stimulate sprouting. Avoid bruising because secondary rot can come in after bruising. So you think about every step along the way. Are there any stages where onions are getting bumped around? You want to treat them like they're glass Christmas ornaments. Okay, moving on to curing conditions. During the process of curing, the outer layers are drying out, tightening, and forming a papery skin that seals the bulb, forming a protective barrier to moisture and diseases. Similarly, the neck withers down and seals, preventing moisture from entering the bulb. So we're setting the stage for long-term storability. It takes about 2 weeks. The optimum conditions are 68 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit and 70% relative humidity. Large-scale growers are heating the air temperature to 3 to 5 degrees above the ambient air temperature. So the best skin development is 75 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's another reason why you don't want to be harvesting in that really hot weather. because if you're artificially curing, you're gonna have to heat it up even more, which makes that really challenging. We don't want it to be higher than 90 degrees because that causes the skin to get dark and it's favorable for bacterial diseases. If black mold is an issue, you don't want that temperature higher than 82. So my growers are running at about 77. If the onions have poor skin or have been touched by frost, you want to keep the temperatures below 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And so the relative humidity of the air going in is 50% or less. When it comes out of the pile, at first it's higher, but once the air coming out of the pile is closer to 50%, then you know that the curing is complete and the onions are dried down. The airflow should be 3 cubic feet per cubic foot of product per minute. So my area of expertise is not how you design curing conditions on a small scale, but I'm just telling you what the optimum conditions are. And if there's anything you can do on your end to implement that, theoretically, you could have improved quality. Use crates or boxes or bins with slots to allow for air circulation. The shallower depth is the better. They're going to dry. And feel free to monitor the temperature and relative humidity just to see what kind of conditions your onions are exposed to. And I just wanted to acknowledge that large scale, the majority of the onions are actually cured naturally outside in boxes. They will bring them in the second half of October with the goal of getting everything in the barn by Thanksgiving. I wanted to share with you a study that I did as part of the Stop the Rot project. I was trying to win the rot race with artificial curing because I wanted those necks to dry down really fast. So the situation was I had a field where the onions had 65% green foliage. They were on track to dying standing up, but the roots were still holding on. So we were still getting some size. And 79% of the plants had symptoms of bacterial disease. When I cut those bulbs, the bacterial rot had only reached the bulb in 19% of the cases. Theoretically, we had the opportunity to win the rot race and not let that bacteria get into the bulb. So I basically went in and harvested those onions that day, topped them, put them on a drying wall, and compared them to naturally curing in the field. These charts are basically showing that the conditions on the drying wall were warmer and drier with less fluctuations than field conditions. And here's another illustration of that. On top, you can see the conditions in artificial curing compared to the field, like the difference in fluctuating temperatures. And here's the results of that trial. So we're looking at bulb rot, and the gray is what the grower did. So basically, he pulled the onions 2 weeks later, harvested them 5 days after that. So that 19% rot increased to 23%. So most of the foliage symptoms naturally didn't even go into the bulb anyway. I pulled early on August 29th, 2 weeks ahead of the grower, but because the foliage was already ratty, it didn't really make much difference. My onions were ready to harvest only 5 days ahead of the growers, which didn't really make any difference for rot at all. But look at what happened when I put them on the drying wall. I actually significantly increased bacterial rot to 32%, and I had a little bit of a yield reduction because of all of that rot. So in retrospect, harvesting those onions early with the green tops, I'm introducing new bacterial infections, and on the drying wall with the increased temperature, I created conditions that are even more favorable for rot. So that just illustrates how that green neck and the temperature are favorable for bacterial diseases. And also topping green, I know 80% of those plants have rotten neck. I could easily have been introducing new infections to bulbs that were otherwise healthy. Moving on to storing conditions. So the optimum is 32 to 34 degrees Fahrenheit and 65 to 70% relative humidity. A lot of growers are storing onions 40 to 45. The warmer the temperatures, it's just going to reduce the long-term storability. They're not going to store as long, but it's acceptable. And you want to bring the temperature down slowly. So you don't want to be artificially curing them in a high tunnel and then bring them into a refrigerated storage. You want to bring those temperatures down slowly. And you want to protect your cured onions from direct sunlight because that can cause greening. And a lot of growers are pre-grading. They're sorting out the rots ahead of time. If you're putting rotten onions in storage, they have a lot of moisture, and moisture just drives more disease. They can spill out and ooze onto other healthy bulbs. And then here's just some pictures of different smaller scale onion storages. Okay, so moving on to some in-season management practices of bacterial diseases. So the Stop the Rot Project did a lot of work with bactericides. In 9 field trials, no treatments significantly reduced bacterial rot compared to the untreated control. And you can see we looked at a lot of different products. In blue are ones that I looked at personally in 3 different trials over a 2 or 3 year period. Small, medium, large particle coppers, plant defense activators such as Lifeguard or Actigard, Oxidate, some biologicals, nothing worked. The bacteria is in the neck, and we simply cannot target it with a spray that only has, for the most part, contact activity. Furthermore, 50% of the Pantoa agglomerans strains sequenced to date carry genes that make them resistant to copper. So there's high levels of copper resistance in the bacteria that we're finding in onions. Furthermore, when the conditions are really hot, there was phytotoxicity. So we are no longer recommending bactericides to manage bacterial diseases. You cannot spray your way out of this disease. Moving on to cultural practices to manage bacterial diseases. This is work that I did on sweet onions, actually in Pennsylvania. And so we were just taking onions off of standard black plastic and putting them on reflective silver, biodegradable black plastic, or bare ground, and significantly reduced bacterial rot by 59 to 75%. Huge reductions in rot, which translated into a 3x increase in yield. In the bare ground, we didn't weed those plots, so we lost some yield due to weed. But that black plastic is hot, and bacterial diseases like hot. So here's the black plastic. You can see the onions melting down with rot. Silver, healthy foliage, cooler conditions, cooler canopy. Also, the cooler conditions are more favorable for onions putting on size as well. So there's a yield bump with the silver plus less rot. The black plastic hugs the bulbs and keeps the heat in around the bulb. The biodegradable black plastic degrades and eliminates that. And bare ground, of course, the issue is you have to manage your weeds. Okay, we did some studies with plant spacing. How much space per plant do you give, and how does that affect bacterial diseases? So a standard spacing that we started with was 4 rows in a 3-foot bed with 8-inch plant spacing, so 48 square inches per plant. In our trial, we had 10-inch plant spacing on either 4 or 3 rows per bed, so 60 and 80 square inches per plant. And then we narrowed that plant spacing to 4 inches with 4 rows per bed or 3 rows per bed, so 32 and 24 square inches per plant. As we increase the amount of space per plant, bacterial rot increases. We had a significant reduction in rot from the standard 8-inch spacing when we dropped it down to 4 inches or 24 to 32 square inches per plant. We significantly reduced rot from 35% to about 12%, a 66% reduction. Huge. Here's a visual of that, the grower standard. You can see the leaves melting down with rot. The wider spacing, we've got fewer plants and even more rot. And then we've got the narrow spacing, we've got more plants, and we have a much healthier foliage here. So here's the yield data from the standard spacing. When we widen the spacing and have fewer plants with more rot, we have a 37 to 57% reduction in yield. When we tighten up the spacing, we have more plants and less rot, so basically doubling the yield. Here's the bulb size distribution from the trial where we didn't have any rot compared to a trial where we did. So when we don't have any rot, we're looking at colossals, jumbos, mediums, and smalls. As the space per plant increases, colossals also increase. The more space you give it, the more they take and they get big. And the majority of the bulbs are falling into the jumbo size class with the narrow plant spacings and the standard spacing. Now, when we have rot, as space per plant increases, the number of colossals decrease, which basically means that it's the big bulbs that are rotting. Okay, so it's the infrared part of the light spectrum that is related to the maturity of the plant. So when the infrared is bouncing around on the leaves, that increases maturity. So when you have reduced spacing, you have less of that. It delays maturity. Plants continue to put on leaves, which means that they get thick necks. As we know, that decreases your chances of winning the rot race. It could take a long time to dry that down while the bacteria has time to make its way into the neck. If anybody's interested in storing sweet onions, I don't know if you do this, but cooking onions that are stored get a sprout inhibitor. So malic hydrazide is a growth regulator that's applied to storage bound onions. When there's 50% tops down, the plants have to have 5 to 8 leaves for it to adequately be taken up and translocated into the bulb. And the last thing I wanted to mention is just a little bit about nitrogen fertilizer. Onions use approximately zero point 0.2 pounds of nitrogen per 100 pounds of yield. So, doing some math, getting 480 pounds on a 100-foot bed, that would be 0.96 pounds of actual nitrogen per bed, which would translate into 139 pounds per acre. For a high yielding crop, it's using 140 pounds of nitrogen. But because onions are inefficient feeders with their low density roots that have few root hairs, you have to add more nitrogen for the crop to take up what they need. So I multiply that by a 25 to 50% buffer, which in pounds per acre is going to be 174 to 208. And what you'd be putting on of actual urea would be 2.5 to 4 pounds per 100-foot bed. And then I just also wanted to highlight that 75% of the nitrogen is taken up from the early bulb swell until lodging begins. So when you're looking at a 2 or 3 leaf onion, that's only used 3% of its total nitrogen needs at that time. The trick is that you don't want to lose nitrogen to leaching early in the spring before bulbing begins, but you also don't want to have too much nitrogen during bulbing because it'll just keep putting on vegetative growth, delaying maturity, getting those thick necks, which could be more favorable for bacterial rot. So it's tricky. And just a reminder that nitrogen moves with water. So it could be in the soil, but if it's dry, the uptake is going to be significantly reduced. So if you're doing drip irrigation or you're supplementing natural rainfall with irrigation, that'll ensure that the nitrogen is available when the onion need it. And finally, I just wanted to mention that with the reflective silver mulches, that is definitely going to be keeping the soil cooler in the spring, which is going to delay the release of nitrogen or slow it down. So if you're using reflective mulch, you might want to consider using a starter fertilizer with phosphorus, like a pop-up, to get the roots growing and get those plants off to a better start. Maybe you want to have some beds with the black plastic so you can get that early planting advantage, get those bulbs up to size for early market, but then have some of them on reflective silver that are going to be a little bit slower making size, but have less rot. Okay, that is what I had.